She traded the struggle of her past for a gilded cage, but now the cage is rattling, and the one man she left behind is playing a dangerous endgame. The scent of old money clung to the air in that penthouse apartment, a cloying, expensive perfume that masked the rot beneath. I remember looking out over the glittering sprawl of the city, 27 floors up, and thinking, this is it. This is freedom. Freedom from the cramped studio, the student loan debt that felt like an anchor chaining me to mediocrity, and most of all, freedom from Michael. Michael. God, even his name felt heavy now, saturated with the memory of damp apartments and microwave dinners. He was a good man, perhaps too good, too honest, too stuck. He believed in meritocracy, in working your way up. I believed in shortcuts, or at least the most efficient route available. And Julian Thorne was the ultimate express lane. Julian wasn't just wealthy, he was a monument to acquisition. His hands, usually resting near a glass of single malt scotch, looked sculpted for signing million-dollar checks. He hadn't courted me, he'd acquired me. I was the bright, ambitious art history student he'd met volunteering at a gallery opening, a splash of vibrant color against his tailored gray backdrop. When I told Michael I was leaving, the silence in our tiny kitchen was louder than any argument we'd ever had. He didn't shout. He didn't beg. He just looked at the framed print of Monet we'd bought together, our only real splurge, and then slowly, deliberately took it off the wall. "You're trading everything we built," he'd said, his voice scraped raw, "for something that can be bought and sold tomorrow, Ilara." "I'm trading struggle for stability, Michael," I'd countered, already picturing the silk scarves Julian had promised me. "I deserve more than barely scraping by." I walked out that night with 2 suitcases and a heart that felt oddly light, like an empty helium balloon finally released from its string. The first 6 months with Julian were intoxicating. Limousines, Mediterranean holidays where the sand was impossibly white, and the thrill of wearing jewelry that cost more than Michael's entire student loan balance. Julian was possessive, yes, demanding my time and my presence, but his demands were cushioned by cashmere and diamond solitaires. I convinced myself this was love, or at least the practical, high-yield version of it. Then came the wedding invitation, not ours, but Michael's. It arrived in a thick, cream envelope embossed with an unfamiliar, elegant crest. Michael was marrying a woman named Sarah, a librarian apparently. Sarah, a simple, grounded name. I almost threw the invitation into the fire pit on Julian's terrace, the jealousy a sharp, unexpected jab. It wasn't that I wanted Michael back. It was the sting of him moving on so easily, finding his stable happiness without the luxury I'd sought. Julian found me staring at the invitation later that evening, swirling ice in his tumbler. "What's this, darling?" he asked, his tone casual, but his eyes, those cold, calculating eyes, were already dissecting me. I tried to sound indifferent. "Just an old acquaintance. Someone from university." He took the card from my trembling fingers, his grip surprisingly tight. He scanned the names, the date, the venue. A small historical church downtown, miles away from Julian's usual gilded circles. A slow, knowing smile spread across his face, a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Ah, Michael," Julian murmured, dropping the invitation onto the mahogany desk as if it were contaminated. "Your little bohemian friend. You should go, Ilara. A final farewell to the past." I looked up, shocked by his sudden permissiveness. "Really? You don't mind?" "Mind what, my dear?" He leaned in, smelling faintly of expensive leather and cigar smoke. "You are with me now. His simple life is beneath us. Go, see what you avoided. A little reminder of why you chose wisely." I should have seen the trap. I should have felt the predatory gleam in his eyes. But I was drunk on validation. I agreed. I would go, wear the emerald dress Julian had bought me in Milan, and show Michael exactly what wisely chosen looked like. The day of the wedding dawned bright and mercilessly sunny. I drove Julian's absurdly large German sedan myself. His driver had the day off. I arrived at the church 15 minutes before the ceremony was scheduled to start, the emerald dress feeling less like armor and more like a spotlight. The sanctuary was packed, mostly with people who looked like they knew how to bake sourdough and volunteer at animal shelters. I slipped into the back pew, trying to be invisible, but the dress made sure I was anything but. As the organist launched into the wedding march, Michael appeared at the end of the aisle, impeccably dressed, looking genuinely radiant. He turned, not towards the altar, but scanning the assembled guests, searching for someone. His eyes swept over the crowd, past the beaming relatives, past the flower girls, until they locked onto me in the shadows of the back pew. The radiant smile didn't falter. In fact, it seemed to broaden, taking on a triumphant, unsettling edge. Then, the side door opened, and Sarah began her walk down the aisle. She was beautiful, yes, in a quiet, unassuming way. But as she reached Michael's side, she didn't look at him. She looked directly at me. And in her hand, clutched tightly, wasn't a bouquet of roses or lilies. It was the small framed print of Monet that Michael had taken off our kitchen wall all those months ago, and around the bottom edge of the frame, scrawled in thick black marker, was a single chilling word that made the blood freeze in my veins. Soon. The word soon hung in the air between the altar and the back pew, heavier than any vows being exchanged. Sarah, Mrs. Michael held my gaze, and in that millisecond I saw no librarian sweetness, only a chilling, fierce protectiveness aimed squarely at me. The Monet print was an artifact, a deliberate message, and I felt a cold sweat break out beneath the expensive silk of my emerald dress. This wasn't just a wedding, it was a stage for an unscripted confrontation. I scrambled out of the pew, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. I had to get out. I had to call Julian, demand an explanation, or perhaps just demand to be whisked away to a continent where old boyfriends didn't use wedding ceremonies to issue threats. I bolted for the side exit, the heavy oak door muffling the sound of the minister finally beginning the service, but the feeling of being watched only intensified. I fumbled with the ornate brass handle, my carefully manicured nails scraping uselessly against the cold metal. It wouldn't turn. I pushed harder, panic lending me a desperate, unladylike strength, but the door was sealed shut, locked. "Are you all right, dear?" A kindly-looking elderly woman, dressed in lavender lace, peered at me over the top of a hymnal from the pew directly beside the door. Her expression was saccharine concern, but her eyes held a distinct, unnerving glint. I think I'm feeling faint," I managed, leaning against the wood. "I need some air." "Oh, you poor thing," she cooed, but she didn't move to help me. "It's so emotional, isn't it? Seeing true, simple love." I ignored her, frantically checking my phone. No signal. Of course. The thick stone walls of this ancient little church were designed to keep the modern world out, and right now they were keeping me in. I looked back through the stained glass windows lining the nave. The crowd was completely absorbed in the ceremony. Michael and Sarah stood at the front, a picture of quiet domestic bliss, but I knew it was a facade. They had planned this. I backed away from the door and darted down a narrow, dark hallway, leading presumably toward the vestry or perhaps a side chapel. The air here smelled of beeswax and dust, a sharp contrast to the perfumed opulence of Julian's life. I rounded a corner, expecting empty corridors, but instead I walked directly into someone. It was Michael. He stood blocking the passage, not radiating joy, but a contained, frightening stillness. He wasn't wearing his tuxedo jacket. His white shirt sleeves were rolled up to his forearms. The effect was surprisingly rugged, stripping away the gentle veneer I remembered. "Ilara," he said, his voice low, devoid of inflection. It was the voice of a judge passing sentence, not an ex-boyfriend. "Michael, I didn't mean to interrupt," I stammered, trying to sidestep him. "Congratulations, I should go." He didn't move. He just watched me, his gaze sweeping from my head down to the ridiculous emerald dress, lingering for a moment on the diamond bracelet Julian had given me last week, a bracelet that suddenly felt heavy, like a shackle. "You came," he noted, a ghost of a smile touching his lips. "I was hoping you would. You needed to see what you left behind." "I left behind poverty, Michael. I chose security." The words sounded pathetic even to my own ears, defensive and hollow. Security? He let out a short, dry laugh. You mistake gilded cages for safety. You chose Julian Thorne, Alara, and Julian Thorne collects things. He collects art, he collects companies, and he collects people who are useful to him. You don't know anything about Julian, I spat, adrenaline overriding my fear. I know everything about Julian, Michael countered, taking a slow step toward me. I know he has a habit of acquiring things his competitors want, and I know that the acquisition process sometimes leaves witnesses needing management. My breath hitched. What are you talking about? Sarah is my witness, Michael said, nodding toward the sanctuary. And you, Alara, are about to become mine. Suddenly, the scent of beeswax was overpowered by something else, a sharp metallic tang, like copper and ozone. I heard a faint rhythmic thump, thump, thump coming from somewhere above us, vibrating through the ancient floorboards. It sounded like a heavy object being dragged across wood. Get out of my way, Michael, I whispered, my voice shaking. He stepped aside then, not smoothly but abruptly, as if he'd finished his required dialogue. He pointed down the hall, back toward the main doors. Go, run back to your mansion, but know this, you running is part of the plan, just like you coming here was part of the plan. Confused and terrified, I didn't hesitate. I sprinted back toward the main entrance, pushing against the heavy oak door again. This time, the lock clicked, and the door swung inward, revealing the bright sunlight and the gathered wedding guests staring at me, the glamorous, disruptive stranger, as if I were a ghost. I burst through the doors, ignoring the gasp from the lavender lady, and dove into the waiting sedan. I jammed the key into the ignition, twisting it violently. The engine roared to life. I slammed the car into reverse, tires squealing on the gravel drive. As I sped away, heart still pounding from the encounter with Michael, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time at the quiet stone church. And that's when I saw the driver. Standing right where the German sedan had been parked, leaning against the stone baptismal font that Julian's car had obscured, was a man I didn't recognize. Tall, dressed in dark, expensive clothing that wasn't Julian's tailored European cut, but something heavier, more utilitarian. He wasn't looking at the receding car. He was looking directly at the church door, and as I watched, he raised a device to his ear. He wasn't waiting for me to leave. He was waiting for a signal that had clearly just been given by Michael. The sedan shot onto the main road, and my phone buzzed violently in the cup holder, a flood of notifications I'd ignored during the ceremony. Most were junk, but one was from Julian's private security firm, overriding all standard protocols. It was a single encrypted text message that flashed across the screen. Immediate extraction required. Target compromised. Do not return to residence. And below that, a chilling follow-up. The package has been secured. The security alert from Julian's firm wasn't a standard warning about a security breach. It was a code red, a panicked recognition that the ecosystem I inhabited was collapsing around me. Target compromised. Do not return to residence. Target? Was I the target or was Julian? And what in God's name was the package? I slammed on the brakes, the powerful German sedan fishtailing slightly on the asphalt. I had just escaped the church where Michael and Sarah had clearly orchestrated a warning, possibly a trap, and now Julian's own people were telling me to run in the opposite direction. The fragile structure of my gilded life was shattering, revealing sharp, dangerous edges underneath. I looked at the text again, my fingers hovering over the reply button, but I knew any response would be tracked. I had to drive, blindly, away from the city center, away from Julian's known strongholds. I took the nearest highway exit, heading toward the anonymity of the suburbs, trying to piece together the fragments. Michael's chilling composure, Sarah's deliberate display of the Monet, the unknown man by the font, and now Julian's directive to flee. They were all connected, weaving a net that had tightened suddenly and violently. My mind flashed back to the cryptic text on the Monet frame, soon. It wasn't a threat aimed at Michael or Sarah. It was a warning for me. They hadn't just married. They had made a move. I pulled into the parking lot of a dilapidated, fluorescent-lit hardware store, the antithesis of anything Julian would ever approve of, and cut the engine. The silence rushed in, thick and heavy. I stripped off the diamond bracelet, tossing it onto the passenger seat like a snake shedding poisoned skin. I needed information. My personal laptop was securely encrypted at the penthouse, inaccessible. My burner phone was dead, but I remembered one place Julian never bothered to check. The old dusty cloud storage account I used in my university days, linked only to my long, obsolete student email. Fumbling in my designer handbag, I located a cheap, disposable tablet I'd bought months ago, a concession Julian had grudgingly allowed for reading lengthy auction catalogs on long flights. It had basic connectivity. I logged into the ancient email, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against the silence of the parking lot. The inbox was nearly empty, save for years of spam and forgotten newsletters. But there was one unread email, dated 3 months prior, from an untraceable address. Subject line, The Thorn Collection, Final Appraisal. I opened it, my eyes scanning the dense financial jargon until they hit the attached PDF. It wasn't an appraisal for art or real estate. It was a comprehensive ledger of offshore accounts, shell corporations, and leveraged holdings, Julian Thorn's true assets, the ones that operated outside the purview of SEC filings and legitimate business fronts. It was a financial skeleton key to his entire empire. And then I saw the name associated with the largest, most secretive trust, Michael. Michael wasn't just an idealistic academic. He was an architect of Thorn's legitimate acquisition strategy, the respectable face that smoothed the way for Julian's hostile takeovers. They weren't enemies. They were partners who had reached a professional, perhaps personal, impasse. But why the charade at the wedding? Why the cryptic warning if they were on the same side? I scrolled down to the signature block of the appraisal document. It wasn't signed by Michael. It was signed by Sarah. Sarah, the librarian. Sarah, the quiet wife. Sarah, who was clearly more than just a bride. Suddenly, the tablet flashed a warning, a red bar across the top of the screen. System compromise detected. GPS triangulation initiated. They hadn't just known I was running, they had been monitoring this specific account, waiting for me to access the very file that explained everything. The hardware store parking lot went from being a safe haven to a trap in milliseconds. I ripped the charging cable out, adrenaline surging. They were closing in. But as the tablet screen began to glitch, displaying fragmented images of the ledger, one thing crystallized with terrifying clarity. Julian hadn't hired me for my knowledge of art. He'd hired me because I was Michael's ex, a convenient pawn in their internal power struggle. Michael and Sarah hadn't been warning me away from Julian. They were warning Julian that I had found the proof of their betrayal. I threw the tablet onto the driver's seat and reached for the door handle. I had to ditch the car, blend in, disappear. Just as my fingers touched the cool metal, the passenger side window exploded inward with a deafening crack. Shards of reinforced glass peppered the seat where the tablet had been. And looming over the shattered opening, framed by the broken glass, was the silhouette of the man I'd seen by the baptismal font. He wasn't holding a phone anymore. He was holding something black and very heavy, and the muzzle was pointed directly at my chest. "Ilera," a voice rasped, distorted by a voice modulator hidden beneath his collar. "Mr. Thorn sends his regards. He says the package is not secured, and now you are collateral." The sound of the explosion of glass was deafening, instantly overloading my senses. Instinct, honed by months of walking on eggshells around Julian's volatile moods, took over. I didn't scream. I threw myself sideways, kicking out with my heel against the passenger door panel in a desperate bid for momentum. The heavy weapon, it looked like a suppressed submachine gun, discharged once. The bullet didn't hit me, but it punched through the headrest of the driver's seat, sending a plume of foam and shredded leather into the air where my skull had been a fraction of a second before. The sheer proximity of death was a physical shock, stealing the air from my lungs. I scrambled out of the driver's side door, abandoning the sedan, the engine still running, illuminating the scene in the dim light of the failing afternoon. The gunman, lean, efficient, and utterly ruthless, was already moving around the wreckage of the shattered window, his movements economic, practiced. He wore dark tactical gear, utterly incongruous against the backdrop of garden gnomes and bags of mulch visible in the hardware store window. "Stay put!" he barked, his synthesized voice scraping over the screech of the car alarm that had finally been triggered by the gunshot. I didn't obey. I ran toward the back of the store, past the dumpsters overflowing with discarded cardboard boxes. This wasn't a robbery. This was an execution ordered by someone who had just orchestrated a very public wedding. Michael and Sarah hadn't just betrayed Julian. They had initiated a hostile takeover that involved eliminating the competition, and I was now firmly categorized as competition, or worse, loose end. I ducked behind a stack of stacked pallets, the smell of pine competing with the lingering scent of gunpowder. My lungs burned. I was wearing an emerald dress and designer heels. I was equipped for a gala, not a gunfight in a suburban refuse area. The gunman didn't rush. He knew the terrain, or perhaps he just knew I had nowhere to go. I heard the soft click hiss of his boots on the asphalt as he began a slow, methodical sweep. I needed a weapon, anything. My eyes darted around the confined space. Nothing useful. Then I saw a glint reflecting the store lights. A long, wicked-looking machete displayed ironically in a garden tools clearance bin. Pathetic odds, but better than nothing. As the gunman rounded the corner of the pallets, his weapon already raised, I launched myself sideways, grabbing the machete. It was heavier than I expected, the steel surprisingly sharp even through the packaging plastic. I swung wildly, a primal scream caught in my throat. I didn't aim for him. I aimed for the only cover I had, the precarious mountain of stacked pallets separating us. The machete sliced through the thin plastic wrapping and bit deep into the dry wood of the top pallet. The structure groaned in protest. The gunman paused, momentarily thrown by the sheer, unexpected ferocity of the attack, even if it missed him entirely. That second was all I needed. I put my shoulder into the remaining wood, shoving with every ounce of adrenaline-fueled strength. The entire stack, dozens of pallets loaded with bags of concrete mix and fertilizer, sheared away from the base with a deafening roar. The sound was like a freight train derailing. The gunman was engulfed in a cascade of heavy, dusty bags. I didn't wait to see if he was buried or merely inconvenienced. I sprinted out from behind the debris, back toward the front of the store. The car alarm was still screaming, drawing attention. I needed to get off the main road entirely. I spotted a narrow, overgrown dirt path behind the store, likely an old service access road. I plunged into the undergrowth, the emerald fabric of my dress snagging and tearing on thorns and low-hanging branches. The machete felt heavy and clumsy in my hand, but it was the only thing connecting me to survival. After what felt like an eternity of stumbling through darkness, I emerged onto a quiet, tree-lined residential street, far removed from the commercial chaos. I leaned against a massive oak, sucking in ragged breaths, listening desperately for the sound of pursuit. Nothing, just the chirping of crickets and the distant wail of the forgotten car alarm. I checked my phone again. Still no signal, but the battery meter had dropped critically low, perhaps due to the security breach alert. I had maybe 5 minutes of life left on the device. Before the battery died, I managed to pull up the encrypted text chain with Julian's security chief. I typed out one desperate message, knowing this might be my final communication. Package name? What do they want? The response was instantaneous, overriding the low-power warning. The package is the server key, Alara. Michael and Sarah have initiated the Thorn hostile takeover. They used you to get close to Julian, and now they're using your escape as the diversion. The key is physically located. The screen flickered violently. The text dissolved into static, the battery giving its final gasp before dying completely. The last image burned into my memory before the screen went black was the partial address of where the key was allegedly hidden. In the false bottom of the bronze bust in Julian's study. I stood there, paralyzed, the machete slipping slightly in my sweaty grip. The server key. The key to Julian's entire hidden empire, now the prize in a deadly corporate coup orchestrated by Michael and his new wife. If Michael had engineered my escape to draw Julian's security apparatus away, it meant they were already moving on the penthouse to seize that key. I looked back the way I came, toward the city skyline barely visible through the trees. I had a choice: keep running and live as a hunted fugitive, or use the last shred of my connection to Julian's world. I still had the key to Julian's penthouse security codes hidden deep inside a compartment in my high-heeled shoe. If I went back now, I would be walking directly into the crossfire between Julian's forces and Michael's new alliance. But if I didn't go, Michael and Sarah would gain undisputed control over everything Julian had built, and I would be left with nothing but a torn dress and a dead burner phone. Taking a deep, steadying breath, I turned back toward the distant lights of the city, the heavy machete suddenly feeling less like a burden and more like an equalizer. I had traded one cage for another, but now I was fighting for the only thing left to claim: my own survival. As I stepped back onto the paved road, the sound of heavy-duty tires crunching gravel echoed from the far end of the quiet residential street. Not the pursuit I expected, but an arrival. 2 large black SUVs, completely unmarked, rolled silently to a stop 50 yards away, their windows tinted impenetrably dark. And then 2 doors opened in unison, revealing figures moving with the same cold, practiced efficiency as the gunmen. They weren't Julian's security. They weren't Michael's mercenaries. They looked military grade, and they were blocking my path back to the city. But the real shock came when the man who stepped out of the lead SUV, a figure silhouetted against the street lamp, raised his hand in a precise, almost formal gesture. He wasn't threatening me, he was beckoning. And as he moved into the light, I recognized the impossibly sharp tailoring, the cold, proprietary eyes, and the faint, familiar aroma of expensive scotch. Julian Thorne had returned, and he wasn't smiling. Julian Thorne stood silhouetted against the street lamp, looking less like a betrayed tycoon and more like a predator, who had merely permitted his prey to briefly escape the perimeter. The 2 men flanking him were clearly his private enforcement, not the slick corporate guards I was accustomed to, but hardened operatives who moved with lethal grace. The machete felt like a child's toy in my hand, suddenly useless. "Alara," Julian said, his voice perfectly modulated, cutting through the night air. He didn't sound angry. He sounded deeply, profoundly disappointed, the kind of disappointment reserved for an asset that had failed its primary function. "You always did make a scene, running into the suburbs, trading the Bentley for a hardware store dumpster dive. So melodramatic." I held my ground, raising the machete slightly, a pathetic defense against the professional weaponry pointed my way. "The package, the server key. Michael and Sarah are moving on your assets." Julian let out a slow, theatrical sigh, turning slightly toward the jungle of overgrown shrubs I had just fought through. "Of course they are. Michael always had the vision, Sarah the operational patience. They've been playing the long game since I first brought them into the financial architecture. You, Alara." He paused, his eyes dissecting my torn dress and dusty face. "You were merely the pressure gauge, the litmus test." "A test for what?" I managed to choke out, my voice raw. "For loyalty, my dear. The moment you left me for my supposed wealth, you proved you had no loyalty to anything but immediate comfort. But Michael and Sarah? They had loyalty to the system. They believed they deserved to inherit it, not just serve it. Your little excursion confirmed my suspicions. Michael was getting too ambitious." The revelation landed with the force of a physical blow. Michael hadn't been planning to overthrow Julian. He'd been planning to replace him, using Sarah and perhaps even me as leverage in the internal power struggle. "The key is in your study," Julian continued, stepping forward slightly. An invitation and a command rolled into one. "They will be there now. They think they're ahead. They think I'm preoccupied dealing with the chaos you caused. The police called to the church, the smashed car, the noise at the warehouse." He gestured toward the black SUVs. "My teams are running interference, making noise where they think I'm vulnerable. But my real focus," he locked eyes with me, is recovering the key before they decrypt the secondary layers. And for that, I need someone who knows the penthouse intimately, someone who can bypass the personal biometric locks Julian Thorne installed specifically for his most treasured possessions. He wasn't condemning me. He was offering a final, terrifying chance at reinstatement. Karma hadn't brought me misery. It had brought me back to the man who controlled the board. "If I go back with you," I whispered, the realization dawning that I had no choice but to align with the devil I knew. "What happens to Michael and Sarah?" Julian's smile finally returned, a chilling, predatory curve of the lips. "They will be neutralized. Swiftly, permanently. They underestimated the cost of true aspiration, Alara. They forgot that in my world, ambition without absolute obedience is treason." He stepped closer, reaching out one gloved hand, not to touch me, but to indicate the path back to the SUVs. "Drop the gardening tool. Get in the car. This time your value isn't based on what you wear, but on your memory. You're not my trophy anymore, Alara. You are my leverage." I stared at the machete, then at the unwavering darkness in Julian's eyes. I had dreamed of joy through wealth, and instead I had found a horrifying, intricate game of thrones. I let the machete fall with a dull thud onto the asphalt. The sound was swallowed by the approaching sirens. Not the police this time, but Julian's specialized response team, arriving to clean up the mess I had made at the hardware store. I walked toward the open door of the SUV, climbing over the wreckage of the shattered glass. As the door closed behind me, sealing me into the dark, pressurized cabin, Julian leaned in close. "You see, Alara," he murmured, his breath warm against my ear, "karma doesn't deliver poetic justice. It simply realigns the debts, and right now you owe me everything." The vehicle surged forward, speeding back toward the city lights, not to safety, but directly into the heart of the battle for Julian Thorne's empire, a battle where my own life was the currency. And as we sped toward the towering silhouette of the penthouse, I realized the true horror. I wasn't running from Michael's betrayal. I was being driven by Julian's counter-betrayal, and I had no idea who would be left alive when the sun rose.